My guest at this time is Horace Cooper. He's a senior fellow at the National Center for Public Policy Research, and he's also co-chair at the Project 21 National Advisory Board. We want to get his reaction as an attorney to prosecutors in Chicago dropping all 16 felony charges against actor Jussie Smollett in connection with the hate crime hoax police and prosecutors initially accused him of perpetrating. And the police still do. And actually the prosecutors do too. Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel and leaders of the Chicago Police Department are furious at the decision. We'll talk about it now. And Horace, thanks so much for being with us.
It's great to be on the program.
Well, the prosecutors say that they have not exonerated Smollett. They still believe he did what they accuse him of doing. But the very narrow statement here is, quote, after reviewing all of the facts and circumstances of the case, including Mr. Smollett's volunteer service in the community and agreement to forfeit his bond to the city of Chicago, we believe this outcome is a just disposition and appropriate resolution to the case. What do you make of that explanation?
I believe that Mr. Garagos, the celebrity attorney, is probably doing somersaults over this amazing deal that got crafted. There is nothing I have witnessed in my time, both as a law professor and an attorney, where a prosecution is completely dropped, not deferred, but completely dropped, without an acknowledgement of some sort of act of contrition and without any new information coming in that calls into question the substance of the original allegations.
So when you look at this case, based on what you just said, I mean, some folks are pointing out that, look, prosecutors make deals all the time. There's some charges they think are worth pursuing and others that there aren't, even if they think people are guilty. They've got to prioritize. Sounds like you're not thinking this was a result of that type of thinking.
This isn't about prioritizing. As I said, they had the option of a deferred prosecution agreement where he would come forward. He may have to pay a small fine. He may be monitored. And if he agreed to not engage in criminal acts, then his charges might be dropped. That is a public event. You come forward in a court of law. This is not what happened. In this particular case, they simply said that the charges that a grand jury heard and responded to and recommended 16 separate counts of violations were sufficient to be brought forward for a jury, that the original judge, when hearing these charges, also set bond and agreed that this needed to be carried forward and not dismissed. When something like this occurs, it is a sign that we are not talking about what happens to the average American. We are talking about what happens when people are exceptions to the rule, when people do not have to be bound by the rules. Now, what's revealing, I think, to some people is that this differential between what happens with Main Street Americans and those who are penthouse Americans, it isn't actually a function of race. It's a function of wealth and status. Black Americans, brown Americans, white Americans, we should all come together recognizing that sometimes people get to cut in the line, and it's not about their race or any other aspect about them other than their wealth and privilege.
So there's a lot of ideas coming out there. You're saying this is coming down to the fact that he's wealthy or perhaps famous. Some would say based on his politics, perhaps. Other folks are saying, well, this is Chicago. What do you expect? It's corrupt to the core. Others are pointing out that Michelle Obama's former chief of staff made a phone call perhaps on Smollett's behalf here. Do you believe this is basically due only to privilege and wealth, or are there other factors here too?
Garagos does not do volunteer work. He does not help those impoverished clients who have claims of either criminal injustice or any other kind of unfair charges. He works for those who are elites. And in this particular case, an elite got a chance to walk. If you and I were charged, the former first ladies, lawyers, friends will not be calling on our behalf. There is nothing like this for Main Street America. But again, what I want to point out is this is not a case of the race of a person was held against them or held in favor of them. This is an example of what is happening increasingly, and that is people of privilege get to walk and escape from the consequences that the rest of us on Main Street would be bound liable for.
So what do we do about that?
Well, I actually think it's important that the Chicago Police Department ask if the judge will reconsider not the charge. That is something that is not going to be able to be readily undone, but at least reconsider unsealing the charges. And I would also ask that the Chicago Police Department consider formally asking the federal government if they will investigate aspects of this investigation that are not subject to the court order that was reached today. In either instance, there still might be an opportunity for justice to actually be served. I would say that if you're an American and you're concerned about how it is easy for people of privilege to escape the consequences that you and I would all be bound to, that perhaps we might want to encourage the Chicago Police Department to take exactly that stand.
The police, as expected, were pretty upset about this, but so was Mayor Rahm Emanuel at a level that I think a lot of folks who are critical of this decision might be surprised by. A lot of different clips, but here's one of them that he had at his press statement today.
Mr. Smollett is still saying that he is innocent, still running down the Chicago Police Department. How dare him? How dare him? After everybody saw, and I want to remind you, this is not the superintendent's word against his. The grand jury, a sliver of the evidence, and they came to a conclusion, as did the state's attorney's office.
And he also pointed out that Smollett's the one who started the whole thing by making the police report in the first place. So what did you make of the mayor's reaction?
His phrase that this was a whitewash of justice was on point. Once again, a deliberate process where meticulous investigation and hours and hundreds of thousands of dollars in man-hour equivalents were spent to investigate a case which ended up showing to be completely lacking in merit. When an opportunity was presented, and by the way, the listeners need to remember this, the very first time that the grand jury came back, they issued one indictment, and that one indictment gave an opportunity for Jussie Smollett to accept responsibility, and it was very unlikely that there would have been any kind of significant penalty. It was only after he indicated that not only would he not accept responsibility, but that he would continue maligning law enforcement, that the additional information that had been uncovered was brought to a grand jury. It is a whitewash when the prosecutors admit that there's no fallacy in the evidence, there's no so-called Brady evidence that would have likely demonstrated that this case couldn't have gotten a successful conviction, that there have been no changes on the part of witnesses. When that kind of case is dismissed, not for a deferred prosecution agreement, but an actual dismissal with prejudice, that is the kind of thing that is not happening with Main Street America. That is something that only those who have the wealth, privilege, and the contacts and connections can be able to obtain. That's not American justice.
Last topic here, Horace, and Mayor Emanuel also spent a lot of time talking about how outraged he was that Smollett took advantage of hate crime laws to perpetrate this hoax. He talked about all the effort he put into protect various minorities by enacting these laws. And I know from a conservative perspective, there's quite a bit of resistance to hate crime laws, with the idea being if somebody punches you in the face, they ought to face the punishment for that, regardless of motivation and so forth. So where do you come down on hate crimes in general and the idea that the mayor says that this could make future victims less likely to be believed?
Well, it is likely that we are going to see more skepticism when people come forward with allegations of mistreatment. That is correct. But it's also correct that there are some philosophical issues associated with treating certain types of bad behavior with a different penalty than others. If you rob a person, if you slap a person, if you malign a person, the reason why you do those things shouldn't be a factor in whether or not you're held accountable for doing them. So that's a problem of hate crime legislation. It is true that there are many advocates of hate crime legislation who have failed to appreciate, as they pushed forward these initiatives, that they would in fact empower individuals to manipulate the system. It turns out that there is a lot more action taken in cities like Chicago or New Orleans or Detroit when individuals claim that there are hate crime violations occurring than when just Main Street Americans argue that just basic violations of their integrity or their property are occurring. This utilization of resources likely might not have even occurred were it not for the hate crime element of it. That would be sad, as that has traditionally been proven to be true. But none of that changes that when you go to the law enforcement community and you make a false claim, even unrelated to hate crimes, and that is shown not to be true, that there shouldn't be a consequence for that. If I pick up the phone and claim that there is an explosion or some other kind of event about to occur, and I do so as a hoax, as a member of the Main Street of America, I will be fully held accountable for that. Here's an example where wealth and elite status allowed a person to be exempt from that accountability.
Horace, we'll call time there. Thank you, sir, very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Horace Cooper, Senior Fellow at the National Center for Public Policy Research. He's also co-chair at the Project 21 National Advisory Board. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.